unSILOed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to unSILOed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here today with Greg Berns, who is a neuroscientist at Emory University and the author of, numerous books. I've got a bunch here. You've got one called The Self Delusion, which just came out recently, the new neuroscience of how we invent and reinvent our identities. Also, this one, this is kind of way back. I didn't realize how long ago this was, but it's called Iconoclast, A Neuroscientist Reveals How to Think Differently. And I think this was with Harvard Business School Press, because I think you're teaching, I guess you teach in the business school too, right? At Emory, not just in neuroscience. And then you got a couple books on the animal kingdom, two on dogs, How Dogs Love Us, What It's Like to Be a Dog. And I think one of these was on the New York Times bestseller list. And the most recent book is called Cowpuppy, The Unexpected Friendship and a Scientist's Journey into the Secret World of Cows, which came about as a result of your recent migration to a farm. Right? So welcome, Greg. Glad you could join me.
Hey, love to be here.
So I thought we'd start with humans, and then we could move to the animal kingdom. I found it interesting that you find animals right more interesting than humans at this moment in your life, because for me the humans, particularly the part in the self. I mean, I'd love to know the extent to which you think the insights around the self delusion apply to other life forms, because it does seem like the thing that makes humans unique, some would say, is our narrative capacity, right? Our ability to tell stories, to confabulate, and the extent to which our perception is shaped by these schema or these narratives or these frameworks, right, that we develop socially through language. And I found that the insight in both of these books about humans particularly useful to me in my teaching. I teach a course on game theory. And over the years, I've mixed in more and more what we call behavioral game theory into the standard game theory. And the only way to do that is to talk a lot about theory of mind and talk a lot about empathy and talk a lot about, how people make sense of other people. And so, I guess, when we think about humans, do you think that most people, I guess, underestimate the extent to which their schema influenced their subjective experience of the world? I mean, do you think that most people have this view of experience that I think you call like the video cassette recorder view of the world, where they think they have some primary engagement with the world, and they simply don't understand the extent to which they are engaging in dissociation and confabulation and all this other stuff?
I do, because the question that you're asking is really, can our brains as a computer think about us thinking? And I think we can to a certain extent, but that doesn't go to infinite levels. There's only so many levels of recursion that are available to us. And so as you point out, and I've written about this in terms of how people think about their perception of the world. I mean, to be honest, we don't give any thought to the perception process. And I mean, guess just to back up a little bit, what perception is the process by which our brains take inputs from the senses, whether it's vision, auditory, tactile, whatever. Those are inputs to the brain that the brain then has to interpret as to what they mean. And we don't have conscious access to that transduction process. It gets to a certain point in our cortex, and then we become aware of it. And I think what's important to realize about the whole process of perception is that, I mean, if you think about it, our senses are limited. So let's just talk about vision because we're visual creatures, and I think it's the sense that everyone knows the best. We take it, I think, without question that what we're seeing is how the world is. But if you unpack that process a little bit, and you'll kind of immediately see, well, how ridiculous that assumption is, because what's actually happening is that photons are bouncing around the world, and some will enter our eyes and then impinge on our retinas in the left and right eyes, assuming you have two functioning eyes. But the retina itself is like a camera chip in many ways. It's just a two-dimensional sheet of neurons that then transmits that information to the back of our heads in the visual cortex. And then there's still kind of a rough map back there. But our perception of the world is not like looking at a TV screen. We have some kind of feeling that, one, it's three-dimensional. If we're using both eyes, it feels 3D, and it seems that way. But then you go beyond that, and then we immediately start making assumptions about what we're seeing. We label things in terms of, whether it's a cup, a ball, a dog, a car. We have labels for all of those things, and frequently when we see those things and we identify it, or our brains identify it, then we just kind of stop at that. And it's like, oh, well, that's a dog. That's that person I know. And in essence, the brain takes the path of least resistance. And once something's identified in the field of view, it's like, okay, well, I don't need to divert any more attention and look at it that much more closely. But it's a dynamic process because you can override it. If you want, you can stare at something and you will most definitely see things that you didn't see before, even though, of course, they were always there. It's just, we weren't paying attention and it wasn't processed. So that's just, I think, at the most simplest level of description. I think the things that interest me go much deeper than that and kind of reflect my history in science and studying how the human brain processes things. So, for example, one area that I've been interested in a long time is how do other people's opinions influence what we perceive? So taking an example from the internet era, everything has 5-star ratings. And if you see a book or a song or a movie is rated 5 stars, does that make you like it more? Even if you haven't seen it. So when you read it, listen to it, and it's already popular, how does that change your perception?
Yeah, well, I mean, economists like to think that you are somehow, coming out of the womb with a preference function, right? I mean, you say you spend a lot of time around economists. I mean, that must be extremely frustrating for you when they say things like that, when, preferences are clearly endogenous, right?
Well, I mean, as you know, I think it's an open question still amongst economists whether preferences are endogenous or constructed, and the degree to which they're constructed on an as-needed basis. I think my view of it is I think we tend to fool ourselves a little bit in that our preferences are endogenous because, again, it comes back to thinking about us thinking. It's like, okay, well, I prefer vanilla ice cream over chocolate ice cream. Well, has it always been that way? I don't know. Or is it just something that I have come to believe out of habit and it's not necessarily the case, or that it even changes based on the circumstance?
Right. I mean, that's what I meant by endogenous, meaning that you're not born with them, that they are an output rather than the pure input, right? So they are a result of your experience in the world rather than the thing that exists prior to your experience in the world. I mean, I really like that work, particularly the work that you did when you replicated the Asch experiment. I mean, I remember in college as an undergraduate, I took a social psych course with, I don't know if you know, John Sabini. I think he was, one of the early pioneers. And you point out that this was like a relatively young discipline. But folks like Ash, I mean, they didn't have the ability to do MRIs, and now you do. So you can see what's going on, right? And you can see the process. And I guess the self-report, when people would describe what was happening when they would go along with the crowd, it wasn't really fully informative compared to what you can see with the brain scans, right?
No, I mean, and that's kind of been that's been the history of that kind of research, is that when you ask people why they do something, it's unclear whether they don't know, or they know and they don't want to tell people, or they know and they don't even want to tell themselves. And I think certainly when it comes to things like social conformity or social pressure or things or preferences that are, socially sanctioned or just not popular, I think it's always been the case a bit of all of that. And so does brain imaging get around that? Back when we were doing those Ash experiments, it was my belief that, yeah, we could use fMRI to essentially open the black box and see what was going on in people's heads without having to ask them. I think there's it's still possible. I think, the techniques have gotten more sophisticated since we did those experiments. Nowadays, most fMRI researchers are using some kind of machine learning / decoding techniques to essentially extract information from the brain that turns out to be a lot more powerful than, what we were doing almost 20 years ago with those Ash experiments, where we were focusing on individual brain regions. So I think, yes, the power is there to extract more information than we have in the past, with the caveat, though, that those machine learning models still have to be trained. And that has, I think that's still a bottleneck and a limitation of taking those types of things as a gold standard, if you will.
So when we see people conform, right, in something like the Ash experiment, to what extent is that a product of fear of social exclusion, right, which would presumably involve the amygdala, and to what extent is it simply offloading cognition, right, and saying, well, I'm going to defer to the wisdom of the crowd?
I think it can be either of them. I think in our experiments, we've seen evidence of both. So certainly it was the case when people went against the crowd, whether it was in that experiment or in some of our experiments with teenagers and their preference for music, if it was not a popular choice, we would see evidence of amygdala activation during those things. And although we didn't ask the people at the time how they were feeling, and I don't think that headway it would have yielded any useful information, the amygdala activation suggests at least what we would call physiological arousal. And kind of taken in context, one would say, well, yeah, they were feeling kind of the uncomfort of being the odd person out. And so, yeah, I think in that circumstance, it is kind of this fear of going against the crowd, which then constrains their choice, their output side of it. Even though at some other part of the brain, they might have a different preference. And so kind of coming back again, to these economic models of individual actors, I think what the brain imaging work suggests is that, in fact, even though we are individuals and we only have one body to act upon the world with, in fact, we have a kind of a society of individual actors in our head that may not always agree. Eventually, something has to take control of the body and do something, but that doesn't fully account for the subjective experience of, well, hey, I like this thing that's unpopular, but I'm going to suppress that because I feel uncomfortable about it. So that's one possibility. And the other possibility, which we also saw evidence of, is that that just gets completely bypassed and short-circuited to probably just to avoid the unpleasantness at all. and you just see things differently. And Ash himself thought about that possibility when he was debriefing his subjects back in the 50s and essentially dismissed it. He didn't think that it was possible because those experiments were designed to be perceptually ambiguous. I mean, he couldn't see how a group could change perception that drastically. But honestly, I think kind of in a lot of real world circumstances, things are not that perceptually unambiguous. And it's very possible for a group to kind of shift how you see the world, literally.
Well, and that's because they're making predictions to some degree, right? I mean, you talked about how these schema which influence our perception are motivated by the lazy brain, right? That wants to make predictions, make them quickly, make them efficiently, and make them in a way that is, more likely to be right than wrong. I mean, I love Kinesis triangle, right? And isn't that related to the sort of blue dress, gold dress phenomenon, right? Where at the very level of perception, you are shaped by sort of prior experience. I didn't realize the extent to which Kinesis triangle depended on sort of prior exposure to geometric shapes.
Well, that's my interpretation of the Kinesis triangle. I think there have been various explanations.
Sort of lays down. So the experience is it's like training data. So you get all this training data, and then the training data leads to the predictions.
That's right. I think that's a lot of what perception is, because when we started this conversation, I pointed out it's like, okay, well, you've seen your partner 1,000 times. It's like you think you know what they look like, but do you really? Because your brain is just, you're not attending to details, and so you have this image in your mind, literally your mind's eye, of the person you may know the best or think you know the best. But maybe you actually aren't processing. It's just based on past experience because it's by rote. You've seen each other day after day after day. So there's not a lot of reason for your brain to waste energy to reprocess it. And so I think with visual illusions, it's the same thing. Many of these visual illusions are based on the fact that, when the brain takes these inputs, essentially what it's doing is it's trying to recreate what it thinks it's seeing. That's what perception is. So you're taking the photons, which are just photons, and then your mind creates a perception of what it is that you're looking. So it has to reverse engineer it. And the way it learns how to do that is by interacting with the world. And because the world doesn't change that much, it becomes essentially a prediction problem. But the thing about this whole process is that it's not a fully constrained problem. All visual perception has multiple interpretations. So, at one point, I've used the example of if you see a tall person standing in a room and you think they're tall, mm-hmm. like they're at the end of a hallway and it looks like they're almost touching the ceiling. You assume that it's a tall person because you're used to seeing hallways of, 8 or 9 feet, but maybe it's just a short hallway and the person's actually normal size. You don't know until you get closer and you get further information. And so that's something that's just based on past experience. And the way out of this trap is through new experiences. At least that's what I've argued, is when you have new experiences, you can't rely on past experience as much to interpret the world. And so it's like the first time of anything is your clearest perception because it hasn't been biased as much by past experience.
But when you say new experience, I mean, you're talking about not just sort of out of sample data. I mean, you're talking about stuff that is more likely to, I guess, disrupt or disconfirm your priors, right? So you would presumably target specific types of new experiences. I mean, in machine learning, we have the same issue, right? Where if you want to improve the quality of the model, then, you can't just go and collect data that is consistent with the data that you already have, right? You have to go and look for those edge cases that will, create a much more precise boundary, right, in your classifier. That seems like a life project, but we're lazy, right? People are lazy. I'm always wondering the extent to which this system is optimal. My mom used to always say, don't assume you'll make an ass out of you and me, which of course is completely unrealistic. You have to make assumptions. But can we sort of design, I don't know, a system of cognition that makes the optimal amount of assumptions? If you question everything, you can't cross the street. So how do we figure out the extent to which we ought to be these iconoclasts, the extent to which we ought to take a look at that triangle and exert effort to pivot back and forth between the triangle and the Pac-Men?
It's a good question. You're asking for essentially a life skill. How to optimally live one's life, perhaps? Is that the question?
Well, there's all this literature about mismatch, right? So, the reason why we don't have a desire to exercise is because, in the Paleolithic era, we had to exercise and it wasn't, and now it's like a luxury. We desired sugar because it was rare and now it's abundant. So, is this energy conservation principle that we use, is this just sort of, is this a poor adaptation to a world where, look, if you need more energy for your brain, just, go eat an energy bar, right? Why not just exert more effort mentally?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's something, I raise constantly, in some of the classes that I teach undergraduates, because, they're at a point in their life where, up until this point, their view of who they are and what they're going to be has been dictated largely by other people. And so, you get to a certain age and then you have more agency in deciding what to do with your life. And it's hugely important. And I think, I think you're right. I think probably, our brains evolved in a different era, certainly, more energy constrained, or at least nutritionally constrained, when that was a primary determinant of what to do, which is how to eat. So for most people in the world now, that is not a primary determinant of their choices. Obviously not for everyone, but it's much better than it used to be 20 years ago. That's for sure. So it can't be that our brains are just starving and, we're just operating that little light bulb, 40 watts of energy, whatever it is. I think it's deeper than that. I think it goes back to our motivational systems, and, it may be tied in the same problem, but so if you get into things like the dopamine system and the striatal/limbic system, it's primarily driven by attention to near-term, short-term gains, or the prospect of it. And there's relatively little in our brains that seem to be optimized for longer-term gains. And so this is, to me, this is really kind of the heart of the human dilemma, which is that, we make plans for the future because we have the cortex and the cognitive capacity to think about the future and think about ourselves in the future, perhaps a very distant future. And we can make all these plans for them that, as far as we know, no other animal can do this. And yet, when we're faced with the opportunity to take kind of a short-term gain because it feels good, it pays off, whatever, all those long-term plans just go out the window. And to me, that's the greatest problem, is counteracting that. And I've written a bit about kind of ways that we might get around that. And one of the ways is, so I've talked about novel experiences. And the thing about novel experiences is that they're anxiety provoking. Unless, I mean, for the minority of people who really thrive on that, for most people, they like the status quo. They like the comfort of things being predictable, and things being unpredictable causes a great deal of anxiety. Even though, if you ask pretty much everyone, the most memorable experiences in their life, the things that they think most fondly of, are probably the things that were most difficult and the things that initially did cause all that anxiety or were uncomfortable. And the things that we as humans attach meaning to are the things that are they're meaningful because they're difficult. And so that's what interests me.
So one possibility is that the sophistication of the kind of classifiers that we're using in the world is underdeveloped. And if we invest more energy, we can come up with a more refined way of understanding the world. But another possibility might be that we just have the kind of cost benefit matrix wrong. In other words, we maybe in our ancestral past, uncertainty was more dangerous, and the social being a social outcast was more costly. And so we fear these things perhaps more than we should. Because you said that the two things that sort of get in the way of looking at the world in new ways are the fear around uncertainty and the fear of kind of social ostracism. So, I mean, those things don't pose nearly the amount of threat as they may have in the past, right? So maybe training ourselves to readjust those penalties would help us to discover more.
So, I mean, as you were speaking, I'm kind of putting myself in the shoes of my students and my children who may have a different opinion about that. I mean, I agree with what you said, but you and I are of a certain age and have had a certain level of life experience pre-internet. So I guess, most of my life was pre-internet, and I find that I increasingly have a discordant view of the world than generations younger than me. I oftentimes don't understand it. So, for example, I'm teaching a class this semester, a new class that I developed called The Psychology of Sustainability, which is, okay, if we're talking about sustainability in the world, that requires a different mindset. What does that mean? And one of the things that we've talked about in the class has to do with social media and how much time the students spend, or as we have said, waste on social media. Interesting side question of whether time is something that can be wasted or not. And so to get back to this fear of ostracization, it's not necessarily that, but it seems now it's the fear of missing out, or FOMO, that seems to be driving a huge amount of people's decision making, which that wasn't a thing for me. I don't know about you. Because it's like you grew up in your own little world and you only kind of knew what, you experienced yourself directly. I mean, in what you read in books and saw on TV, which was limited. It wasn't that you had like the world at your fingertips and you could see what the world is doing. It's like that wasn't even a thing. So you didn't know what you were missing out on. And so it seems like a lot of that has tapped into, I think it's probably a very similar type of social learning, not being kicked out of the tribe, but just the fear that someone's doing better than you.
Well, it's interesting about the social learning, because it seems like when we move from in-person to online, there's two things that happen. One is that you can more quickly become aware of the opinion of a larger number of people, but they're also kind of one step removed. I mean, you talked about how, for instance, in a stag and hare game, if you want to kind of stimulate more cooperation, then it pays to have sort of the sense that you're dealing with another human being and that you have the ability to kind of visualize them and visualize their face. And so one would expect that when most of your interactions are in real life, right? Physical, that would lead to a greater fear of social ostracism. And when you are dealing with people at sort of one step remove, it would kind of matter less. But it seems to matter more. Is that because the fact that you have more rapid exposure to people's opinions in a much larger number? I mean, you talked a lot about the importance of visualizing faces, and I really like that, because when I do my simulations of games like Stag and Hare in class, we talk a lot about that, right? We talk a lot about if you know who the person is, if you have a vision of the person, it affects things. If you're dealing face to face, it sort of affects things, and the kind of, when it becomes just this abstract thing with some remote entity, it changes things dramatically. So why is it that social media seems to lead to maybe a greater conformity effect?
That's a good question. I'm not sure I know the answer to that. Other than, I think, talk about perceptions. Social media is a very biased, it's not it doesn't lead to true perceptions because of its very nature. And this is something I try, to impress upon my students. It's like, okay, so this FOMO, it's bad to begin with, but it's probably based on misperceptions of what everyone else is doing in the first place, because they're just posting crap that, it's how they want to portray themselves to the rest of the world, which leads to this kind of arms race in like, hey, look how great my life is. Look at all this cool stuff I'm doing, without giving you a picture of, okay, they're sad on the inside, or, it's, if you had this in-person interaction with a person, you might pick up, kind of their truer state of mind. So maybe social media leads to this conformity just because it's an arms race of, hey, my life's great.
Well, you talked about individual differences, right? And you said there are some people that are, have a moral backbone, or some people who are iconoclasts. To what extent is that something that we think of as given, and to what extent is that made? Are there life paths or life trajectories or experiences that lead one to be, more, I guess, capable of questioning the status quo?
It's probably the case of both. Some people, I think, clearly, from what time they were a child, probably had rebellious tendencies. And then there are other people who I think kind of come into it based on their life trajectory and circumstances put them in such a place that they just say, the hell with it. I'm going to do what I believe is right, and other people, be damned. That might never appear unless the right circumstances occur for that person. And so I think when I wrote Iconoclast, and I apologize because that was a long time ago, that was almost 20 years ago. I think my point is that it can be either. If you want to be someone who thinks out of the box, or be an iconoclast, and to be clear, iconoclast literally means destroyer of icons. Mm-hmm. And many destroyer of icons in the past are usually killed, as was the original iconoclast. So
sometimes they create new icons, right?
Well, yeah, that's called creative destruction, which is probably the mantra in Silicon Valley, right? Mm-hmm. But the point is that if you don't view yourself as an iconoclast, like you've never been someone like that, that doesn't mean you can't be under the right circumstances. You may find yourself in such a circumstance where you decide you have to be the person who steps up and says what they believe, that the emperor has no clothes.
Well, you talk a lot about stories and narratives, and at one point you talk about novels, right? And I found this fascinating, right? Because novels are, I guess, extended stories, and you tried to see if reading novels had some impact on neural activity, that might even kind of be sticky, right? So why is it that humans in particular need these stories? I mean, look, animals do prediction all the time, so I think a lot of your research maps onto animals very well when it comes to their engaging in the world. But I don't think there's any evidence that animals carry around the kinds of complex narratives, engage in the kind of counterfactuals that we do as humans.
No, you're right. As far as we know, only humans tell stories. Uh, I mean, for the rather obvious reason that you need language to tell stories. And although probably all animals communicate with each other, we have not found any convincing evidence that any other species uses language as we formally define it. So they do not have the capability to tell stories, or even tell
So to be clear, like if there's like a bee dance, right? The bee's just saying, "Yo, there's stuff over there," right? That's it. It's just a kind of a factual communication. Yeah. It's not like, "Oh man, I went over there and I got this stuff and it was great," or anything like that.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, yeah, and so yes, I am fascinated with storytelling, because we're all storytellers. Even if you write scientific papers, ultimately it's still a story where you again, it's like perception. You do an experiment, you collect data, and yes, I guess at some level we're testing hypotheses, but most scientific papers these days are not about that, to be honest. Most are more in kind of the exploratory sense, where we're doing an experiment because we want to understand something about the world. We might have an idea about it, but it's usually much more nuanced. And then you do the experiment, doesn't turn out the way you expected, and then it's like, well, what happened? So you tell a story about what you think happened and what it means. And I think ultimately that is all that human life is. It is us telling stories, because if it weren't that, then we're not that much different than bees and all the other animals that I study, but we clearly are. And I do think it comes down to making sense of our lives and how the world works. And I think stories go beyond the current state of the art in terms of predictive models. Machine learning probably will take over the world. It's already making kind of credible, I'll call them facsimiles of storytelling, but I think that's what they are right now. We tell stories to ourselves and to each other, like I said, to have meaning in our lives. It's not the case that a machine is ever going to care about what's meaningful. So I do think that meaning in and of itself has value to humans that has yet to be captured in any kind of computer model.
So you talk about encoding, compression, and retrieval. And so, without language, you presumably, whether you're an animal or whether you're a kind of young human, right? You can develop associations, right? And you can effectively know, right, what to go towards and what to go away from. And you presumably have some rudimentary kind of causal model that you can develop. But, why is it that we need to lay down memories in this very, very specific way that involves narrative? Is that how we develop a much richer causal model of the world? I mean, is it fair to say that we have even before modern science, have a much more complex understanding of causal relationships than say animals do, or are even capable of?
Yeah, I mean, it is. Now, so let me back up a little bit what you said. So it is certainly the case. Associative learning can be very sophisticated. Obviously, animals are doing very sophisticated forms of learning, which may at the kind of very lowest level still be some kind of associative learning of some type, but you can build incredibly complex models from that mechanism alone. The thing I'm talking about, storytelling and meaning, is not associative. It is by its nature constructed out of our imaginations, which, I mean, granted, they're constrained by the physical world, but to prove this, all you have to do is just look back through the canon of literature and see how humans have explained the world around them and how it has changed over time. So until recently, most of it was based in religious beliefs. And when you think about religious beliefs, and this is the difference between religion and science, is entirely based on faith. There is, by definition, nothing that you can prove or disprove about your belief in God or anything else in the world. So what is it then? If you explain the world in terms of what God wants or what God says, that's a construction. That is a story that people have told for millennia. And does that mean it's better than what animals do? Well, maybe. I mean, I haven't seen many chimpanzees build beautiful churches in stained glass just because it's this belief that we should do that.
So look, things like superstition and conspiracy theories, right? These things are features, not bugs, right? To the extent that they are, I mean, they're inevitable to some extent based on how we make sense of the world, right?
Yeah. And I talk about these things as how, well, there's kind of these peculiar one-off experiments from the animal behavior literature that, cats and pigeons will form essentially superstitious behavior too, based on random events. The difference with humans is that, so it's not like, baseball players not stepping on the foul line because they believe it's bad luck. That's more of like a random association. But then if they spin it into some elaborate story and some explanation, and it becomes elaborated and this and that, and not changing your underwear and doing all these weird things, then that veers off into some form of narrative explanation for your own weird behaviors, which, only we do. So yeah, that's a feature of our cognition, I think, because we tell stories, we make up stories about everything.
Now, I want to talk a bit about animals. Were you the first person to put a dog in an MRI? Was that, you talked about how it dawned on you that if dogs could be taught to, jump out of helicopters, then you should be able to train them to go into to MRIs. I mean, were you the first one to do that?
Possibly. Certainly I was the first person to publish a paper about it. Yeah, so that was back in 2011, and it was initially motivated by my seeing pictures of military working dogs jumping out of helicopters, and me being a lifelong dog person, instead of thinking about the mission that those dogs were on, I thought, hey, that would be cool. That helicopters sound like MRIs. Wouldn't it be fun to teach my dog to go in the scanner so we could see what she's thinking too, or at least, try to figure out how she thinks. And yeah, so that was the next chapter in my career, where I then entered the dog phase.
Well, in your cow book, you said the cows are as intelligent as dogs. But it seems that dogs have something different, right? They have something special, which results from their sort of coevolution with humans. Are there similarities that dogs have with humans in their brain that makes them different from non-domesticated animals?
I don't think we have the information to answer that question because dogs are the only other animal that have been trained to sit for MRIs voluntarily. So is there something different about a dog brain from, I don't know. Well, I've studied coyote brains, but not in living coyotes. And so I don't know that it's possible to answer that question. However, we do know enough, I think, about how dogs became domesticated in the first place to to at least posit some reasonable theories about what happened that makes them special. And so I'll get back to your question about intelligence, because of course there's different types of intelligence. And I think, what happened with dogs, which would have been a proto-wolf at some point in the last ice age, is that they learned it's like, hey, if we hang around these human encampments, we can probably scavenge for food instead of hunting it. And probably the juvenile wolves, which tend to be friendlier than adult wolves, were the ones who approached these camps. And then my guess is probably human children, started socializing with them. And then those wolves followed humans around. And because we can share the same food, we're very compatible. And because wolves and then dogs could walk with us and follow us wherever we went, then it just kind of, selected for animals that could do that better and better. Does that make them more intelligent? Well, not necessarily, because over and over again, when we study animals, domesticated versus their wild counterparts, it's generally the case that domesticated versions have smaller brains, all things considered, suggesting that domestication itself has done something. I don't want to say make them dumber.
Well, it's true of humans too, right? Our brains kind of shrank a bit after we became more domesticated, right?
Yes, but I don't think anyone knows why, or what the consequence of that is. Just because the brain's smaller doesn't mean that the individual is stupider. But I think when it comes to wolves compared to dogs, I think it's clear that it offloaded a lot of the foraging needs of the wild counterparts, or it certainly made foraging easier. So it's not that it made them dumber. It developed, I think it essentially atrophied certain hunting skills and then bolstered other skills that relate more to being friendlier and shrinking their flight zone and, just essentially incorporating themselves into humans' lives. That, from an evolutionary perspective, was a superior strategy if you look at how many wolves are in the world versus how many dogs. There's one dog for about every 10 people. So there's probably close to 1 billion dogs in the world. There's probably only a couple 100,000 wolves.
Well, it'd be interesting if you could do the Ash experiment on dogs, right? Look at their brains, the extent to which they are thinking about, right, what the humans are thinking about them. Because, it does seem like, it appears to us that dogs have something like a theory of mind. It appears to us that they have emotional states that are similar to ours. But, a lot of people would say, well, that's just conditioned response, right? It's just conditioned response. But, I think part of your point is that it's also a bit of conditioned response in humans too, right?
It is. And, the theory, I have kind of backpedaled a bit on theory of mind, I think, in terms of its importance. I think you can have a very elaborate theory of behavior that in many circumstances might look like theory of mind. If your model of how another being behaves is good enough, you don't need to resort to the much more difficult theory of mind function. And honestly, I think most of us go through most of our day in a theory of behavior mode without having to just like, oh, I wonder what she thinks. Does she know what I'm thinking? that kind of chess, that mental chess game is exhausting, and frankly not necessary in most circumstances. So I think dogs are probably very good at theory of behavior and have a very elaborate theory of our behavior, without having to resort to kind of looking into our heads. I'm on the fence of whether dogs have it or not.
But you also talk about how cows and dogs are very good at recognizing faces, not only for conspecifics, but also for humans. I mean, is that, are dogs particularly better than other species at discriminating among faces? Do they have the similar brain architecture that we do for facial recognition? I mean, I mean, it seems like humans have that to a greater extent than most animals, I guess, because we wind up interacting with, I mean, I think ants just basically sniff other ants, and it's like you're either part of the tribe or you're not part of the tribe. They don't really,
Right.
we don't know, but I guess, I don't know, the MRI is not small enough to get in there and figure out, but I'm guessing that they don't discriminate all of the different ants that they have in their community by face or smell. And we do. I mean, we have the ability to recognize, I don't know, is there a number on this? Like the number of possible, I know Robin Dunbar says, your community tops off at 150, but I mean, I know people that can recognize every single NFL player and every single NBA player, like, every single celebrity. I mean, it seems like there's no limit to the number of faces that a typical human can differentiate.
Yeah, maybe. But again, that's a primate skill. I think probably chimpanzees and other primates probably have similarly good facial recognition, because that's how we interact with each other. We interact face to face. And apart from that, our gaze contains useful information to each other. So we pay particular attention on where other people are looking, because that's a window into where their attention is. And so that's important for primates. It's important for predators too. So wolves, it can probably do the same thing, because when they hunt in packs cooperatively, they have to signal in some way, or coordinate their actions at least. It's probably, with them, it's less dependent on gaze direction, because their snouts are so long, they get a lot of information from head direction. It's not totally clear that dogs are actually that good at recognizing faces, at least from pictures. When we were doing the MRI experiments, we could not find any evidence that the dogs really discriminated the faces of their owners from people that they didn't know. We found it when we presented smells, when we collected scents from owners versus non-owners, that showed some differential response. But the pictures, it could just be the dogs don't like to interact with screens. I don't know. Are you a dog person? Do you have dogs?
Yeah, I like dogs. Not at the moment, but I also like horses, which is why I wanted to ask you, right? When you moved to the farm, I mean, this sounds like a pretty radical shift in lifestyle, because you didn't just move to sort of like a catalog farm. I mean, you moved to a working farm with real animals. And, for most of human history, we were around animals of one type or another, either hunting them or domesticating them. Nowadays, I mean, the only time people see a chicken or a cow is in the butcher, right, or on the plate. How did this affect you? How did this change the way you thought about animals and cognition more generally? I mean, you had to really learn to think like a cow, right?
Yeah. I like to tell people what, I write these books. It's not that I'm just writing books because I have these random ideas. I do live them. So at the end of the Self Delusion, and the Self Delusion was about essentially the power of your own narrative. If you want to change your life, tell a different story about it. And so I changed my story. I mean, yes, I'm still a professor. Yes, I guess I'm still a neuroscientist. But yeah, during COVID, it was like, okay, the hell with this. I'm not going to spend my life on Zoom forever. Let's move to the country and try something different and see what happens. And it was a huge move. And the last 4 years have been the steepest learning curve of, I want to say, my life, or at least my professional career. And the most difficult, and going back to where we started, the most rewarding and most satisfying. And so my love of cows was born out of that, but I can't recall anything from my childhood or anything in my past where I had actually had face-to-face contact with a cow before. And yet somehow I made the decision, well, we have this farm. We're not going to raise horses. Even though I love horses, I just did not want to get into raising them. We need some animals here. Let's get cows. That sounds like a great idea.
So, I mean, but does that sort of map over to the way you interact with humans? I mean, because that seems like it requires some kind of empathic capacity that is, I mean, people talk about, try to understand the position of somebody from a different culture or from a different time period. But I mean, this is trying to look at the world through the perspective of another species. I mean, does that sort of practice of inhabiting the worldview of a creature that is very different from yourself, does that expand how you think of yourself? I mean, does that sort of increase your, umwelt to some degree?
I guess in a very natural sense, I would say. So I think I feel I probably have always felt a deep connection to animals. I certainly grew up with them when I was young. It's why I probably shift to studying dogs from humans and now cows. It does not, I don't think it broadens my empathy for humans. It may broaden my empathy for other animals and nature. Because, I mean, the great thing about animals is because they don't have the language that we do. And so they're not going to tell you suck or you look stupid or this or that or anything else that any other person might say or think about you. They don't think that way. They are very much kind of at face value. And particularly with cows, and they're very different from dogs. They have different evolutionary history. And the thing that drew me to them compared to my dogs, and I love my dogs, but the dogs are kind of sycophants, really. Not for food, but just from parental attention and constantly like, what are we going to do now? What are we going to do now? What are we going to do now? It's like, okay. The cows ask for very little. And much to my surprise, are extremely affectionate. And because they're surrounded by food, I manage their pastures and they're not going to be slaughtered, and I don't use them for anything other than pasture management. Any affection they have for me has to be, to me, a purer version of it, because it's not contingent on me giving them a treat. So they must actually like me. And that's frankly refreshing and something that I wish to share with other people who want to experience it.
I was just thinking about the Monty Roberts story. And I remember when I was exposed to that for the first time, right? The horse whisperer, right? Approach to breaking horses, and, what that required. It required a lot of careful observation, right? It required that you suspend your priors and pay very careful attention to what was going on. I mean, when did you learn how to manage cows by reading books on cow management? Or it seems to me that you spent a lot of time observing them and trying to understand them?
A bit of both. I mean, certainly the literature on cow psychology is limited. Temple Grandin has written several books about that, but her perspective is somewhat different. Probably the most so the thing about cows or cattle more generally is, yes, as I said, they can be very affectionate. However, when you need to do something, or you need to move them from one pasture to another, or you need to give them a vaccination or do anything that they don't like, they can be very difficult. They are flighty, they'll run away. And, once one gets kind of in that frame of mind, then they all are, because they're so strongly bonded as a herd. And it was kind of a process of self-experimentation and learning, because all the other farmers around me have a very different view of cattle, as essentially as food products. They didn't care. So I couldn't go to them for help. The one person that I found, and he's not alive anymore, was this guy named Bud Williams, who was in fact the first cow whisperer. And he lived in California mostly, and he was kind of a cowboy of sorts that ranchers called to help manage difficult herds. And he didn't write any books. Later, he did a few videotaped lectures, but mostly what he said is just kind of passed down from person to person. And he was kind of the first person to say, when you're trying to manage cattle, a couple of mantras. One is slow is fast, meaning if you try to work quickly and force them to do something, it's just going to end up taking longer than if you slow down to their pace. But his big insight was to try to understand what they wanted and understand their motivations. And then once you understand that, constrain their choices such that you get them to do things that you want them to do, but it's under their own volition and their choice. So you constrain their kind of output space. You still let them make the choices, so you're not forcing them to do anything. And that's how you manage them. That was a tremendous insight to me. It's like, then the light bulb went off in my head. That's how you do it.
Yeah, I always thought that people should have horses before they have kids, so they could learn a little bit about management. Last question. Look, you've been teaching a course on decision making, and it seems like that course also is a course on meaning finding to some degree. I mean, part of that is, it seems like it's more philosophy than psychology, and I've had a lot of psychologists on the podcast, and I sort of ask them, is psychology sort of taking the place of philosophy in our world? Is this where you go to find the kind of questions that one would normally find in a philosophy class in psychology nowadays?
God, I hope not. If psychology, if psychology replaces philosophy, then I think it's going to be a very boring world. I did not formally study philosophy, but you're right, because the thing that philosophy offers that I don't think psychology or economics or any other decision-making science offers is this question of why. Why care about anything? Why do we do what we do? Why, humans, because of our cognition and our storytelling ability and all of that, we are cursed with this knowledge of our own mortality. And honestly, that drives a lot of what we do. Whether it's a quest for immortality or a quest for the fact that that it matters, that your life matters, and you want to leave some kind of trace in this world. Those are philosophical questions. They may be religious questions or theological questions, but they are not, I think, I mean, they're not really psychological questions. There's kind of maybe a niche area in psychology that deals with it, but certainly not experimental psychology is not going to answer that question. And so, yeah, there is a place for it, certainly in my decision-making classes, because I'm trying to give students the tools to make good decisions. But ultimately, when you get down to it, you have to have some kind of framework. You can't just kind of bounce from one shiny object or reward to another. You get to a point where it's like, well, what matters?
Well, Greg, thanks so much for joining me. I think all of these books will contribute somewhat to answering that question. This book, Self Delusion, really awesome stuff. Also, this other book on cows, Cowpuppy. Also, check out Iconoclast and the dog books. Let's chat again soon. Thanks so much for joining.
My pleasure.
Okay.